never used to believe those old warnings about picking up hitchhikers. People always told me it was dangerous, but I figured most of them were just unlucky travelers trying to get somewhere. I even told myself I'd never be the kind of person who left someone stranded on the side of the road, especially at night. That was before last November, when I was driving across the state on Highway 47, and I learned exactly why people say never stop. It was close to midnight. The sky so dark it felt like the world ended just beyond the headlights. The road was empty. Nothing but cracked asphalt stretching endlessly in front of me. I'd been driving for hours, fighting off the weight of exhaustion, when I saw him. A figure standing on the shoulder, his arm raised, thumb pointing at the road. At first, I wasn't even sure he was real. He just appeared out of the darkness, tall and thin, wearing an oversized jacket that looked damp and heavy. Something about him unsettled me, but I slowed anyway. When he climbed in, I noticed how cold he was. His skin felt clammy when he shook my hand, his grip lingering too long. He gave me a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Thanks," he said in a voice that was low and raspy, like someone who hadn't spoken in days. Not many stop. I tried to keep things casual, asking where he was headed. He stared straight ahead and said, "Wherever you're going is fine." That didn't make sense, but I didn't push it. We drove in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the tires humming against the road. Then I noticed something strange. His jacket was bone dry now, not a single drop of moisture on it. I could have sworn it was soaked when he got in. After a while, he started talking. He told me he used to live nearby, that he had walked these roads more times than he could count. His words felt rehearsed, as if he was telling a story he'd repeated for years. But then he started describing things he shouldn't have known. He mentioned the exact rest stop I had passed earlier, even the song I'd been humming to myself when I stopped for gas. I hadn't told him any of that. When I asked how he knew, he just smiled. "The road tells me things," he said, "and it tells me about you." The air inside the car grew colder, so cold that my breath fogged the windshield. I reached to turn up the heater, but no warm air came out. I glanced at the hitchhiker and saw him watching me, his lips twitching like he was trying not to laugh. That's when I realized his reflection in the window didn't match his movements. He was sitting perfectly still, but in the glass his head was tilted toward me, smiling wide enough to split his cheeks, to split. I gripped the wheel tighter, fighting the urge to slam on the brakes and throw him out, but something in my gut told me not to. Instead, I asked, "So where did you say you were from?" He chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. I didn't. We drove like that for miles, the silence broken only by his occasional muttering. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like chanting. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. Finally, I decided I had to get rid of him. I pulled onto the next exit, saying I needed to stop for gas. But when I slowed, he turned to me and said, "There's no station here." His voice was sharp, certain, and when I looked, he was right. The exit ramp led to nothing but overgrown weeds and broken pavement. I merged back onto the highway, heart pounding. That's when he leaned closer, his face inches from mine. "Do you know how many people vanish out here?" he whispered. "The road takes them. The road keeps them. And sometimes the road sends one back." His smile widened until it didn't look human anymore, stretching unnaturally across his face. His teeth were sharp, jagged, and his eyes glowed faintly in the dark. I slammed on the brakes. The car screeched to a stop, but when I turned to shove him out, the passenger seat was empty. I sat there for a long time, my chest heaving, every nerve on fire. The car was ice cold, the seat belt still buckled as if someone had been sitting there, I forced myself to keep driving until I reached the next town. At a diner, I told the waitress what happened. She went pale and said, "You picked him up." When I asked what she meant, she leaned closer. "They call him the Hitcher. People see him on Highway 47. Some pick him up, some don't. The ones who do never make it past the county line." I told her I made it. She shook her head. "You think you did?" When I left the diner, I froze. My car was parked where I left it, but in the passenger seat, there was a damp, heavy jacket. And when I got inside, the dashboard clock was blinking. Somehow, without me realizing, 3 hours had passed. I still don't know what happened during that time. Now I never stop for anyone on the road. But sometimes when I glance at my rearview mirror late at night, I see him, sitting in the back seat, smiling. I had been driving for nearly 10 hours without a real break, and when I saw the glowing neon sign that read Valley Pines Motel flickering on the side of the deserted highway, I felt a wave of relief. The road had been long and empty, the kind of road where you start to question whether you are moving at all because the scenery never changes. I pulled off the highway and into the cracked parking lot where weeds had pushed through the asphalt like veins crawling toward the light. The sign buzzed weakly, and I realized that half of the letters no longer lit up. It looked less like a place to rest and more like a warning, but I was too tired to care. The lobby was small and stale, the air smelling faintly of mildew and cigarette smoke, and the man behind the counter looked like he hadn't moved in hours. His skin was pale, his hair greasy, and when he smiled, I saw teeth too straight and white for the rest of him. "Room 12, he said before I could even ask for availability, sliding a key across the counter with a hand that trembled slightly. I glanced at the logbook beside him and noticed the names were all the same handwriting, like he had filled in the register himself for years. I should have left then, but exhaustion had already tied weights around my legs. When I entered room 12, the smell hit me first, a mix of damp carpet and something metallic that clung to the back of my throat. The furniture was outdated, the wallpaper bubbled, and the ceiling fan rotated slowly with a groan. I set my bag down, locked the door, and collapsed onto the bed. The sheets were stiff and cool against my skin, and despite the discomfort, I drifted into sleep almost instantly. I woke to a sound that didn't belong in the quiet of a forgotten motel. It was faint but clear, a rhythmic tapping coming from the bathroom. My first thought was that the pipes were old, but when I opened the door, the sink was dry and the faucet was tightly shut. I turned back toward the bed and froze because the sheets were pulled tight as though no one had slept in them at all. Yet I had just risen from them. My bag was gone from the corner. Panic flushed through me, and I rushed back to the lobby. The man at the desk was still there, but this time his smile was wider, stretching unnaturally across his face. "Did you rest well?" he asked. And before I could answer, I noticed the clock on the wall had skipped forward 8 hours. My car was still outside, but the gas tank was full, even though I hadn't stopped for fuel. He slid the register toward me, tapping at a line with my name already written in, followed by the word "stayed." I didn't sign it, I just ran back to my car. But when I turned the key, the engine didn't roar to life. Instead, the radio flicked on by itself and static poured out of the speakers. Beneath the static was something else. A whispering chorus of voices overlapping, and I swore they were saying my name. I shoved the door open and stumbled back into the lot, only to see every room's curtains pulled open at once, and behind each window stood a figure, perfectly still, staring out at me. They weren't guests. They weren't even alive. Their faces were pale, hollow, and their mouths moved in silent repetition. I bolted into the night, running down the stretch of highway. But after minutes of sprinting, I looked back, and the neon sign of Valley Pines was still glowing behind me. The motel was following me. I tried again, this time driving until my eyes blurred. But no matter how many miles I put between us, the sign would appear ahead, buzzing faintly, its letters dying and reviving, inviting me back. On the third night, I gave up. I walked into the lobby and the man at the desk was waiting. His smile stretched too far now, his skin peeling like wallpaper. "You understand," he whispered. "No one leaves Valley Pines." I dropped the key on the counter and felt my own mouth moving against my will, whispering the same words. When I looked at the register again, my name had been written not once but dozens of times, in neat rows stretching back decades. Now I sit at the counter, waiting for someone new to arrive. When they do, I will hand them the key to room 12, because that's what the motel wants, and the motel always gets what it wants. I'd been driving long-haul routes for almost a decade, and by now I knew the highways better than the lines on my own hand. Nights on the road never bothered me, because there was a strange kind of peace in watching the endless stripe of asphalt stretch out under my headlights while the world around me fell silent. I thought I had seen it all, from broken-down travelers to desperate hitchhikers waving frantically in the dark. And I had always made it a rule to help when I could, because once you've been stranded yourself, you know how much that hand out the window means. That rule nearly killed me. It happened on Route 191 in Arizona, a long, empty stretch with desert on both sides, the kind of place where the horizon swallows everything. The night was moonless and dry, and my truck's radio was just static, so the silence pressed in heavy. That's when I saw her. A woman standing by the side of the road, her figure lit in the harsh beam of my headlights. She was barefoot, wearing a torn white dress that clung to her like it had been wet once and then dried stiff, and her hair hung in a tangled mess that covered half her face. She didn't wave or call out. She just stood there with her arms at her sides, staring at me as I slowed down. Something in me screamed to keep going, but my hands were already pulling the truck onto the shoulder. I leaned over and opened the passenger door, and she climbed in without a word. Her skin was pale and cold like stone, and when she settled into the seat, the smell of damp earth filled the cab. I asked if she needed help, but she didn't answer, just kept her face turned toward the window as if watching something in the dark beyond the desert. I tried again, asking where she was headed, and after a long pause, she whispered, "Home." The way she said it made the hairs on my neck rise because it didn't sound like a destination, it sounded like a promise. I drove on, unsure what else to do, and for miles she sat silent while the sound of my engine filled the space between us. Then she spoke again, her voice barely louder than the hum of the tires. "You shouldn't have stopped." I gripped the wheel tighter, telling myself she was just confused or traumatized. But when I glanced at her reflection in the side mirror, I nearly lost control of the truck. Her head was still facing the window, but in the reflection, her eyes were fixed on me, dark and wide, and her mouth was stretched into a grin that didn't belong on a human face. I blinked hard and looked again, and everything was normal, her hair still covering half her face, her lips closed. I told myself I was tired, that the desert was playing tricks on me, but then the air grew colder. I checked the gauge and the heater was still blowing, yet the temperature inside felt like ice forming in my lungs. My headlights flickered, and for an instant the road ahead disappeared into total darkness, and in that black void I thought I saw shapes moving just beyond the beam, dozens of figures standing in the desert, their heads turning in unison as my truck rolled past. When the light steadied again, the woman finally turned her head toward me, and I nearly slammed the brakes. Her face was wrong. Her eyes were too large, her pupils swallowing the whites, and her skin seemed stretched thin over sharp bones. She smiled and whispered, "Almost there." I demanded to know where she was taking me, and she lifted one pale hand and pointed forward. On the horizon, a cluster of lights flickered like a small town, even though I knew there was nothing for 50 miles in either direction. As I drove closer, the road began to change. The asphalt cracked and narrowed, and weeds forced their way through the surface, yet my truck rolled smoothly as if guided. The lights grew brighter, and soon I saw rows of houses lining the street, but they weren't like any town I'd ever seen. Every house was abandoned, windows shattered, doors hanging loose, yet candles glowed faintly inside. Figures stood in the yards, unmoving, watching me as I passed. Their faces were gray and indistinct, their eyes hollow, and their mouths moved in silent unison like they were repeating the same phrase I could not hear. The woman beside me leaned forward, pressing her hand to the windshield as she whispered, "Home." I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed the brakes, yanked the wheel, and swerved onto the dirt shoulder. The truck fishtailed, and when it stopped, the woman was gone. The passenger seat was empty, the door still shut. But on the seat where she had been sitting was a small pile of damp soil and a single bare footprint pressed into the fabric. The road ahead was dark again. No sign of the town, just desert stretching endlessly in both directions. I turned the truck around and drove until dawn, too afraid to stop, my chest tightening with every mile. When I finally pulled into a gas station, the attendant looked at me strangely and asked if I was all right. I tried to explain what happened, but when I looked into the side mirror as I spoke, I froze. In the reflection, she was sitting behind me in the sleeper cab, her pale face half hidden by her hair, her lips moving in a whisper I couldn't hear. Now I don't stop for anyone, no matter how desperate they look, because sometimes what you see on the side of the road isn't a person at all. And sometimes even if you don't stop, they might find a way inside anyway.